There was a spreadsheet open on my screen the morning they let me go. Not because I was scrambling, because I was always working. I had been at Hargrove Hospitality for 11 years. 11 years of 6 a.m. conference calls with the properties in Nashville and Asheville. 11 years of knowing which vendor in Memphis overcharged on linen contracts, which food and beverage director in Charlotte was padding his invoices, which regional manager filed accurate reports and which one filed optimistic ones. I knew this company, the way you know a house you've lived in so long you can walk through it in the dark without touching a single wall. My title was Director of Operations, but what I actually did was hold the whole thing together with both hands while smiling like it was effortless. My mother would have laughed at that. She always said I got my father's work ethic and her complete inability to ask for credit. She wasn't wrong. What almost no one knew, and I mean almost no one because the people who did know were either retired, dead, or smart enough to keep their mouths shut, was that Hargrove Hospitality existed in its current form because of my mother, not in a sentimental way, in a contractual way. 8 years before I was hired, the company was called Kellerman Boutique Hotels. 3 properties, all in the southeast, all bleeding money. The original owner had overextended during the post-recession optimism and was quietly drowning. My mother, who had spent 30 years building a commercial real estate portfolio in Georgia and had a reputation for seeing value where other people saw wreckage, agreed to provide a bridge loan. $28 million. The kind of number that doesn't get written on cocktail napkins. The kind that gets written into very specific legal language by very careful attorneys. The loan saved the company. The company was restructured, rebranded as Hargrove, and eventually grew to 9 properties across 5 states. My mother's loan was repaid in full within 4 years, but the agreement she signed didn't end there. There was a clause, a protection she'd insisted on, and that the company's original ownership had agreed to because they had no other choice. It gave her the right, under specific triggering conditions, to call an emergency lender review, even after repayment, if the company materially breached certain operational or fiduciary covenanters. One of those covenanters was the wrongful termination of any senior officer she had personally approved during the original restructuring period. She had approved my hire. She hadn't told me about the clause until the night after I was fired. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The man who fired me was named Elliot. He'd been brought in as COO 6 weeks earlier after the board decided they needed fresh operational energy. That was the phrase they used in the internal memo. Fresh operational energy. I remember reading it at my desk and thinking, that's an interesting way to say we're going to bring in someone who doesn't know anything and pay him to act like he does. Elliot was 43, had spent the previous 7 years at a mid-tier hotel management company in Phoenix, and had a handshake that lasted about 2 seconds too long. He wore the same style of slim-cut blazer in rotating colors, navy, charcoal, dark green, and had a habit of starting sentences with "look" when he was about to say something he hadn't fully thought through. I want to be fair. Some people come into new roles and spend the first 60 days listening. They walk the properties. They read the files. They ask the people who have been there longest what the landmines are before they start digging. Elliot was not that kind of person. He came in with a presentation on his 3rd day. A 40-slide deck with phrases like operational redundancy and cost structure rationalization and, my personal favorite, legacy overhead drag. He walked the executive team through it in the glass-walled conference room on the 4th floor. And I sat across from him and watched him point at a chart that I recognized immediately as having been built from incomplete data. I said gently that the vendor comparison on slide 19 didn't account for our negotiated long-term rates, which brought the actual cost per room significantly lower than the industry benchmark he was using. He smiled. It was the smile of someone who had decided, before the meeting started, that anything I said would be categorized as resistance. That's the kind of thinking, he said, that's kept us from pushing for better deals. I didn't argue. I had been in enough rooms to know when arguing was pointless. Over the next 4 weeks, he made a series of decisions that I watched the way you watch someone rearrange a kitchen they don't cook in. He cut the regional maintenance coordinator position, the person who caught small repair issues before they became insurance claims. He restructured the food and beverage reporting chain in a way that created a gap nobody noticed, until the Nashville Properties kitchen passed its health inspection by a margin that made my stomach drop. He brought in a vendor for our linen supply that had a better per-unit price, but a delivery reliability rate that I found in about 20 minutes of research. I flagged each one through proper channels, in writing. The responses I got back were polite. They were also dismissive in the particular way that corporate communication is designed to be, acknowledging without agreeing, thanking without listening. Then came the morning of the 14th. I was at my desk with that spreadsheet open, a quarterly property comparison I build every year, tracking occupancy trends against local event calendars, when Elliot's assistant came to my door and said he'd like to see me. I knew before I stood up. There's a specific quality to the air in those moments. You've probably felt it if you've ever been in one. Everything gets slightly too quiet. Your own footsteps sound a little louder than they should. His office was at the end of the hall. He had rearranged the furniture since moving in. The desk was now angled toward the window, which I suspected was a power positioning choice he'd read about somewhere. His assistant closed the door behind me. There was an HR representative sitting to the left. Young woman, notepad in hand, not making eye contact. Elliot didn't drag it out. I'll give him that. We're restructuring the Director of Operations role, he said. Your position is being eliminated effective today. We appreciate everything you've contributed. I looked at him. 11 years, I said, not as an argument. Just as a fact I wanted in the room. We know, he said, and that's reflected in your severance package. He slid a folder across the desk. I didn't open it. Is there a performance reason? I asked. It's a structural decision. I nodded slowly. I picked up the folder. I thanked him, not because I felt thankful, but because I had spent 11 years being professional and I wasn't going to stop in the last 60 seconds. I went back to my desk, collected what was mine, and walked out of the building at 10:37 in the morning with a cardboard box and 11 years of institutional memory that Elliot would spend the next several months trying and failing to replace. I sat in my car for a while, not crying, just sitting. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that isn't about being tired. It's about having given something your best for a long time and discovering that the best didn't matter as much as you thought it did. I felt that. I let myself feel it. Then I called my mother. She listened without interrupting, which is not her natural tendency, so I knew she was taking it seriously. When I finished, there was a pause. Come to dinner tonight, she said. I have something to show you. My mother lives 40 minutes outside of Atlanta on a property she's owned for 20 years. She has a study that smells like old paper and coffee, and the particular kind of order that comes from someone who has spent decades making high-stakes decisions and needs her environment to reflect that. When I arrived, she was already at her desk. She had a document out, a physical copy, which told me she'd been keeping it somewhere she could find it. Sit down, she said. She walked me through it. The original loan agreement, the restructuring terms, and the clause, Section 14C, 3 paragraphs that I read twice to make sure I was understanding correctly. The clause stipulated that in the event of wrongful termination of any senior officer who had been vetted and approved during the original lender review period, my mother had the right to call an emergency lender covenant review. If the review found a material breach, the company would be required to either reinstate the position or trigger an accelerated financial obligation, not on the original loan which had been repaid, but on a separate performance covenant that had been quietly accruing since the restructuring. The accrued amount, at current calculation, was somewhere in the neighborhood of $28 million, the same number she lent them to begin with. I put the document down. Did you know this would happen? I asked. She looked at me over her reading glasses. I knew this could happen. I built it in because I knew what this industry does to people who know too much and don't hold the right title. I asked her why she'd never told me. She said, because I wanted you to build your career on your work, not on my insurance policy. She made the call the next morning, not to Elliot. To the board chair. a woman named Helen who had been on the Hargrove board for 6 years and who, based on my mother's assessment, was competent enough to understand the gravity of what she was hearing. The call lasted 11 minutes. I know because my mother timed it. Helen called back within the hour. What happened next took about 8 days, and I wasn't in the room for most of it, but I pieced it together from what my mother told me, from a call I had with the company's general counsel, and from the very careful non-disclosure agreement they eventually asked me to sign, which I read in full before signing anything. The board pulled the original loan documents. Their legal team confirmed the clause was valid and enforceable. Elliot's termination decision, made unilaterally, without board approval, of a position that fell under the protected covenant category, constituted a triggering event. The board had two options: reinstate the position with full back pay and protections, or face the accelerated covenant obligation, $28 million. They chose the first option. I was informed by the general counsel on a Thursday afternoon. Formal written offer, my position reinstated. Full compensation, retroactive from the date of termination. A written acknowledgement that the termination had been improper. And Elliot, the board placed him on administrative leave pending a full review of the decisions made during his tenure. 3 weeks later, his contract was terminated. The review found that 3 of the vendor changes he'd implemented had increased operational costs rather than reduced them. The maintenance coordinator position was reinstated. The linen vendor was replaced. His name was added to a confidential internal review file that I was told, professionally and carefully, would be referenced in any future background check processes. I don't know where he went after that. I genuinely don't. But I know he didn't take another COO position at a hospitality company for at least 2 years, because that's a small enough industry that people talk. Here is what I want to tell you about what happened when they called to reinstate me. I didn't say yes immediately. I asked for 48 hours to think. They agreed, which told me they were nervous, which told me I had more leverage than the original call had implied. I spent those 48 hours doing something I hadn't done in 11 years. I thought about what I actually wanted, not what the job required, not what the next promotion looked like, not what the responsible career smart decision was. What I actually wanted. What I wanted was to build something. I had spent 11 years making Hargrove run. I knew the vendors, the markets, the seasonal patterns, the guest behavior data, the things that drove loyalty and the things that quietly killed it. I knew which markets were underserved by boutique hospitality, and I had a very specific idea about how to approach them differently. I called the board's general counsel back on Saturday morning. I told him I was declining reinstatement. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is there something that would change that?" I said yes. I wanted a settlement in lieu of reinstatement. I wanted it structured as a consulting agreement, fair, clean, professionally appropriate. I wasn't looking to bleed the company. I was looking for a bridge. We negotiated for 4 days. My mother's attorney was on the calls. The final agreement was something I'm not going to disclose in detail, but I will tell you it was enough to fund the first 12 months of what I'd been quietly building in my head for longer than I want to admit. I signed it on a Tuesday, walked out of my attorney's office onto Peachtree Street in the October sun, and stood there for a minute just breathing. My mother called while I was still on the sidewalk. "Done?" she asked. "Done," I said. "Good," she said. "Come celebrate. I made the pot roast." That is my mother. $28 million clauses and pot roast on a Tuesday. There are things people get wrong about stories like this one. They assume the point is the revenge. The dramatic moment when the person who underestimated you discovers they were wrong. And I won't pretend that wasn't satisfying. It was, in the specific way that something is satisfying when you've been carrying the weight of it and someone finally sees what that weight actually was. But that wasn't the point. The point was the 48 hours. The decision I made when I could have simply taken my position back and spent the next decade being careful, playing it safe, making sure no one ever had a reason to fire me again. I had spent 11 years being invaluable to someone else's company. And I was good at it. I was genuinely good at it. But there's a difference between being good at something and building something that's yours. Elliot, for all his 43 slides and his operational energy and his slim-cut blazers, actually did me a favor. Not the favor he thought he was doing, the favor of forcing me to ask a question I'd been putting off. I opened my own company 8 months after that Tuesday, a hospitality operations consulting firm, the kind of firm that the Hargroves of the world hire when their fresh COOs have made enough structural decisions to need someone who actually knows the industry to come in and unbreak things. My first client was a boutique hotel group in Savannah. My second was in Chattanooga. By the end of my first year, I had 6 contracts and a waitlist. The irony is not lost on me. I now do for other companies what I spent 11 years doing for Hargrove. Except now, when someone decides my contribution isn't worth protecting, they don't get to make that call unilaterally. I get to make it. I still think about that spreadsheet sometimes, the one that was open on my screen that morning. The quarterly property comparison I've been building for 11 years, tracking occupancy trends against local event calendars. Muscle memory. The kind of thing you do so automatically you don't even think of it as work anymore. I finished it, actually, that afternoon after I got home from sitting in my car. I don't know why. It wasn't for Hargrove anymore. But I finished it anyway because I had started it and I don't leave things unfinished. Then I saved it to my personal drive and closed my laptop. Some things you carry forward, some things you close. I'm learning to know the difference. I've thought a lot about what actually happened in that sequence of events. Not the legal part. I understand the legal part. I mean the deeper mechanics of it. Why Elliot failed. Why my mother succeeded. Why I ended up where I did instead of where I expected. Elliot walked into Hargrove with a presentation and a conclusion he'd already reached before he'd learned a single thing about the place. That's not ambition. That's arrogance, wearing ambition's clothes. And the thing about that particular combination is that it doesn't just create bad decisions, it creates a specific kind of blindness. He couldn't see what he didn't know because he'd already decided he knew enough. Every person who tried to show him the gaps, including me, got filed away as an obstacle rather than a resource. That's how you end up cutting the one position that was quietly preventing insurance claims. That's how you end up with a linen vendor whose trucks don't show up on time. That's how you fire someone without reading the foundational documents that govern your own company. There's a cause and effect to all of it that I find almost mathematical in its clarity. Not in a satisfying movie way, in a real, grinding, ordinary way. He made a series of choices built on incomplete information and unchecked ego, and those choices had consequences that landed on people who hadn't earned them. That's a fact about how the world works. People's bad decisions don't just hurt them, they ripple. But here's the other side of it. My mother spent 30 years building something carefully. She asked the right questions before she signed anything. She protected her interests, not with aggression, but with precision. One clause, written clearly, enforced only when it mattered. That kind of thinking doesn't happen overnight. It's the result of decades of showing up, paying attention, and refusing to let optimism replace preparation. She didn't save me out of sentimentality. She saved me because she had done the work long before either of us knew it would ever be necessary. And me? I had a choice after all of it settled. The easy thing would have been to take my desk back and spend the next decade being careful. I understood that temptation. There is real comfort in the familiar, especially after something that shakes you. But I'd spent 11 years being excellent inside someone else's structure, and what that experience clarified for me, painfully, usefully, was that excellence without ownership is always vulnerable. You can be the most capable person in the building and still be the first one out the door when someone new decides to redraw the org chart. So I chose differently. Not because I was certain it would work, because I was certain that going back would mean choosing the version of my life that was easier to defend rather than the one I actually wanted to build. That distinction between the defensible choice and the true one is something I come back to a lot now. It doesn't get easier to navigate. But I think the willingness to keep asking the question is the thing that matters. Not having all the answers, just refusing to stop asking. I don't think Elliot was a villain. I think he was someone who never learned to question his own assumptions, and in the end, that gap cost him more than it cost me. My mother taught me, mostly by example, rarely by lecture, that the most durable form of intelligence isn't knowing more than other people. It's being honest about what you don't know and doing the work anyway. That's what I'm trying to carry forward. Not the clause, not the settlement. That